Hello and welcome to Byjus Exam Prep and welcome to our daily Hindu analysis. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our official Telegram channel by scanning the QR code in order to get regular updates on current affairs and also on our new initiatives. So let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at the editorial on page number 8 from the Delhi edition. This editorial evaluates the India-Australia trade agreement, which has been recently ratified by the Australian Parliament and is all set to come into force. So first, let's understand the key provisions of the India-Australia trade agreement and then take a look at the editorial analysis. See, earlier this year in April 2022, India-Australia signed the ECTA or the Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement. This happens to be a landmark deal as it is India's first trade agreement with a large country like Australia, and the agreement promises to bring mutual benefits to both the sides. Through this trade agreement, it is expected that the bilateral trade volume will increase to more than $50 billion in the next 5 years from the current $31 billion per year. India is expecting that its exports alone will drive half of this jump in bilateral trade volume, and it is also likely to create more than 1 million job opportunities for both the sides, particularly for the labor-intensive sector in India. Through this trade agreement, duty-free access or zero-duty benefits are being extended to around 98.3% of Australian tariff lines, which will immensely benefit Indian exports to Australia. Over the next 5 years, duty-free access is expected to be extended to all the Indian products which are exported to the Australian market. In return, Australia will also enjoy similar market access, and its exports to India will enjoy zero duty benefits, which will cover almost 90% of its exports in terms of value to India. As Indian industries, especially in the MSME sector, import a lot of essential raw materials from Australia, such as coal, metals, wool, etc., these shipments are expected to become cheaper and will benefit the Indian firms. The trade agreement will also bring benefits to Indian students and Indian workers by liberalizing the visa regime and will allow Indian chefs, Indian yoga trainers to easily find work in Australia and to settle in the country. And in particular, Indian students will stand to benefit as it seeks to simplify the post-study work visa regime. This also covers a double taxation avoidance agreement, which will help the Indian IT firms in particular, and they can hope to save millions of dollars in taxes by avoiding double taxation in both the markets. With regard to goods, Australia is going to give India preferential access, especially to labor-intensive sectors such as gems and jewelry, leather, textiles, footwear and furniture, food processing, engineering products, medical devices, and even automobiles. India, which is already a major importer of Australian coal and Australian mineral ores, will also be extending similar preferential access, thereby benefiting Australian exports to India and also helping Indian industries. The trade agreement will also boost the export of high-quality products from Australia in the agriculture and animal husbandry sector, along with bringing in new machineries and technology in the food processing sector. One of the key features of the agreement is that it covers the export and import of a wide range of alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages, including Australian beer and wine, which finds a big market in India. This is expected to promote industry-wide collaboration between the two sides and is expected to benefit the farmers and producers in both the countries. Apart from this, the ECTA also has a few safety features in order to prevent the misuse of the trade agreement, and includes clear-cut provisions on rules of origin to ensure that third parties and third countries don't misuse this free trade route between India and Australia to dump their goods on the Indian or Australian market. It provides for anti-dumping measures for those products and commodities which do not meet the rules of origin requirements, thus ensuring that the benefits of the free trade agreement are kept limited to producers in India and Australia who are actually carrying out value addition within these countries which are party to the deal. It also has a provision for dispute settlement, and it is the first such trade agreement signed by India which has a mandatory review clause after a period of 15 years. This will allow both the countries to thoroughly review the functioning of the trade agreement after 15 years and plug the drawbacks to ensure that the trade agreement will benefit both the countries equitably. It's in this context that the ratification of the trade agreement by the Australian Parliament is of great significance, as it brings the trade agreement one step closer to being made operationalized. Within the Australian Parliament, the trade agreement has received bipartisan support from all the political parties, which clearly indicates the good image that India holds within Australia's political system, and is also an indication of Australia's growing discomfort over China's aggressiveness in trade, as China has often weaponized its trade advantage against Australia. The ratification of this free trade agreement is also an indication of the growing strategic and economic closeness between India and Australia, as the two countries are already a part of a number of initiatives, including the Quad or the Quadrilateral grouping. They are also part of the Trilateral Supply Chain Resilience Initiative along with Japan, through which they seek to strengthen and diversify global supply chains to reduce dependency on China. And also both countries have joined the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, which has been championed by the United States, with the objective of restructuring the economic landscape of the Indo-Pacific region. The editorial also points out that as governments and companies are adopting the China Plus One strategy in order to move away from their China dependency and to diversify their businesses to alternate destinations, in this context, the growing trade alignment between like-minded countries such as India and Australia becomes all the more important and could bring numerous opportunities for India. This trade agreement could also become a model for other trade agreements that India is currently negotiating with the European Union, with the United Kingdom, and also the one we are negotiating with Canada. But however, India would do well to draw a lesson from its free trade agreements with ASEAN and Japan, because just by signing free trade agreements, automatically India's exports will not receive a boost. This is a bitter experience we have already had with ASEAN and Japan. Through these free trade agreements, the imports from ASEAN and Japan have increased to India, whereas India's exports have still suffered to these two regions. This is primarily because of the lack of global competitiveness of Indian companies and Indian producers. And hence it is very essential for India to come out with the right economic policies and to work closely with the industry and farmers in order to ensure that we boost our domestic production and directly contribute to more exports in order to take the full advantage of these trade agreements. Next, on page number 9, The Hindu carries an important interview with two prominent environmental experts who try to answer the question whether poor countries can afford to switch to greener technologies while they continue to bear the biggest impact of climate change and global warming. This discussion has been brought out in the context of the Loss and Damage Fund, which was recently established at COP27, which seeks to compensate the vulnerable countries as they face the increasing risk of being affected by extreme weather events. After years of negotiations, developed countries have finally agreed to contribute to the Loss and Damage Fund, which is in line with the principles of climate justice, as it ensures that poor and vulnerable countries don't have to pay for the damages, as largely the burden of climate change and global warming lies on developed industrialized nations which are responsible for historical emissions. So while it is justified to expect the developed countries to contribute more towards climate finance, it is also equally important to ask whether developing countries and poor countries should also start switching towards cleaner and renewable forms of energy. Because without this shift, it is highly unlikely that we are going to meet the target of keeping rise in global temperatures to under 1.5 degrees Celsius, which has been agreed to under the Paris Agreement. So let's carry out this analysis based on the opinions expressed by these experts, along with taking the help of a few interesting infographics. See, this chart here clearly depicts the contribution of developed industrialized nations to climate change and global warming. Countries from the developed world, including United States, European countries, Japan, and other industrialized nations, have primarily contributed to human-induced climate change, with very little contribution coming from emerging developing economies and poor vulnerable countries. But clearly, the impact of this is being disproportionately borne by the poor nations, as they are neither capable of dealing with extreme weather events and disasters which are being driven up by climate change and global warming, and nor are they in a position to fund mitigation efforts and adaptation measures to switch towards cleaner forms of energy by moving away from fossil fuels. Today, even though a number of greener technologies are available, it is still difficult for poor countries and even developing nations to carry out this transition, as clean and green technologies continue to be expensive, and they also have a necessity to continue their dependency on fossil fuels at least for some time, in order to first address the socio-economic challenges in their countries and also to gear up their infrastructure in order to sustain the required levels of economic growth. In this context, developed countries have often argued that large developing countries like India, China, Brazil should also start bearing the higher burden, as today these countries have also emerged as top emitters of greenhouse gases. But developing nations and other poor countries led by India have argued against this stand of developed nations, as they fail to take into account the low per capita emissions in developing and poor nations. Today, countries like India, Brazil, and others might be one of the top emitters of greenhouse gases, but still their per capita incomes happen to be extremely low when compared to the developed world, and more importantly, their per capita contribution to emissions is also very, very low as compared to the developed countries. There is no doubt that every country in the world should start implementing greener technologies in their economies, as these sources of energy, including solar, nuclear, hydropower, and even wind and clean powered battery technology, they offer numerous advantages with regard to reducing emissions. But at the same time, one needs to keep in mind the drawbacks of some of the cleaner and renewable technologies, as they are not only expensive and still inaccessible to many countries, they also bring in their own environmental cost, as investments in green technologies will contribute to new forms of emissions and pollution. And this is the reason why there should be global focus on reducing overall greenhouse gas emissions, while keeping in mind the higher burden, especially the economic burden, on poor vulnerable nations. Generally, when it comes to reducing emissions, most countries focus on traditional sources of greenhouse gas emissions, which includes industrial activity, transportation and energy use in buildings, which are largely powered through fossil fuels, and also on agriculture, animal husbandry, landfills, etc. But in addition to this, what they need to take into account is the environmental cost of transitioning towards cleaner technologies as well. Because while clean technologies such as solar, battery driven vehicles, wind, nuclear, and hydropower might be relatively cleaner within their life cycle, but one cannot ignore the related emissions that would come from the cleaner industry as well. Because the production of components in all these sectors will also contribute to emissions as the world makes a transition towards cleaner technologies. And it's in this context that the poor countries may not be able to afford the cleaner technologies, not just because of its higher cost, but also due to its related impact on the environment as a result of its related emissions. So it is very much essential for the developed countries and developing nations, especially the large emerging countries like India, to continue working together to reduce their emissions and to assist other countries. They should also keep in mind the disproportionate impact on the poor, vulnerable countries and continue helping them by treating this as a global goal, as the poor and vulnerable countries may not be able to afford the higher cost of dealing with climate change. Now let's take a look at page number 10, in which we have an important column referring to the increasing militarization of the Arctic region. And let's examine its geopolitical and environmental implications. See, this topic is in news because recently Russia has launched new icebreakers into the Arctic region, which are powered by nuclear energy. Last week, Russian President Putin has launched two nuclear-powered icebreakers and has labeled it as a strategically important development. See, icebreakers are essentially large ships which break the ice slabs and ice shelves in the polar areas to make way for shipping. Such icebreaker ships are being increasingly deployed in the Arctic region by various countries, including Russia, as climate change and global warming has accelerated the melting of polar ice caps, thus opening up new shipping routes near the North Pole, which has triggered an economic and geopolitical race between various countries, especially between the Arctic rim countries, to not just dominate these shipping lanes, but also to gain immediate control over the precious resources of the Arctic. According to various studies, plenty of resources can be found in the Arctic region, including oil, gas, fisheries, rare earth minerals, and along with that, it opens up a new shipping route, which holds great significance for the global economy as it can reduce travel time and reduce dependency on traditional shipping routes. It's in this context that Arctic rim nations such as Russia, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and also Greenland, Canada, and the US have become very proactive in increasing their presence in the Arctic, along with stepping up their military presence. Even non Arctic countries like China, India, Japan, and others are also showing more interest to exercise their influence and reach in the Arctic, thus triggering a Cold War and a new race in the Arctic. See, as the Arctic shipping route opens up, it creates an opportunity to reduce the dependency of the global economy on the Suez Canal and the traditional shipping routes that are currently vulnerable as they pass through choke points such as the Bab el Mandeb Strait, the Hormuz Strait, the Malacca Strait, etc. Also, the existing major shipping routes are longer, thus increasing transportation and logistics cost. So, with the melting of the ice cap in the Arctic, the Northern Sea route is opening up, which promises to create a shorter route between Europe and Asia via the North Pole. And hence, it not only holds great economic significance, but also holds a lot of strategic significance. Along with the opening up of a new shipping route, the presence of immense resources in the North Pole has pushed these countries to enter into a new competition, and hence the Arctic rim nations have already started stepping up their military presence all around the Arctic. You can clearly see in this map how the Arctic rim countries have started setting up new military bases along with reactivating their old naval and air bases in the Arctic. It's not just top global powers such as Russia and US which are carrying out this military outreach towards the Arctic, but even the smaller rim nations such as Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, but even Canada and Greenland are stepping up their military deployment into the Arctic. Russia in particular has carried out a massive militarization of the Arctic over the last 7 to 8 years. And as the largest littoral state of the Arctic, Russia enjoys the advantage of surrounding the Arctic and the Northern Sea route with a chain of military bases, which has allowed Russia to deploy advanced icebreakers, including the nuclear powered icebreakers which have been recently deployed. Even India is not far behind in this strategic competition, as India would also like to exercise its influence and reach in the Arctic for several reasons. But the primary motivation for India would be to counter the rising influence and reach of China in the Arctic. See, even though the Arctic does not belong to any particular country and it is seen as a part of the global commons, all the economic and military and research activities in the Arctic is regulated and controlled through a small group of countries which are members of an important council called the Arctic Council. The members of the Arctic Council include the Arctic littorals or the rim states of the Arctic, such as Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and US. But a number of countries which are non-Arctic powers have also been admitted to the Arctic Council as observer states, which includes France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, China, Poland, South Korea, Singapore, Spain, Switzerland, UK, and even India was admitted as an observer in 2013. Over the decades, India has gradually increased its presence in the Arctic by first signing the Svalbard Treaty in 1920, through which countries agreed to treat the Arctic as part of the global commons. Over the years, India has sent out many scientific expeditions into the Arctic, with the first expedition being carried out in 2007. And next year, India even set up a research base at the Svalbard region of Norway, with a base station known as Himadri. Then in 2014, India even deployed a research observatory called IND-ARC, which was a submerged scientific observatory that India deployed with the help of Norway and has further stepped up its scientific research activities, especially in the Svalbard region. According to data provided by the Ministry of Earth Sciences, since 2007, India's Arctic research program has led to 13 expeditions into the region. And in a landmark step earlier this year, India has even unveiled its first Arctic policy titled India and the Arctic, which focuses on building partnerships with other Arctic members by promoting the spirit of sustainable development. Under the Arctic policy, India has identified 6 key pillars, which includes science and research, climate and environmental practices, economic and human development, transportation and connectivity, governance and international cooperation, and national capacity building. The Arctic policy has been designed to not just increase India's scientific explorations in the Arctic, to understand various geophysical phenomena, including climate change, and also to explore the economic and developmental opportunities available while tapping the new transportation connectivity routes that are going to open up. For achieving these objectives, India is pursuing the path of international cooperation instead of competition and would like to evolve a global governance architecture to treat the Arctic as part of the global common resource. So this approach of India will not only enhance India's national capacity to reach out to the Arctic and explore the Arctic, but will also make India a key power in the region with the ability to counter Chinese influence. Now let's take a look at a column from page number 8, which examines the draft Indian Telecommunication Bill 2022 that has been brought out by the government and has been placed in the public domain for inviting public response and feedback. The writer of the column specifically focuses on one provision of the draft Indian Telecommunication Bill, which seeks to include OTT services under its ambit in order to regulate the OTT segment. OTT or over-the-top services refers to broadcasting and streaming services which are primarily delivered over the top of the internet. This inclusion of OTT platforms under the Telecommunication Bill was supported by the telecom service providers, and in line with the wishes of the telecom industry, the government has sought to bring OTT services under the Telecom Bill itself. But the writer cautions against this and takes a stand against the inclusion of OTT platforms under Telecom Bill, and he points out a few reasons to justify his argument. According to the writer, OTT platforms are already covered under the IT Act of 2000, under which the IT rules were recently notified last year in 2021. The new IT rules, which regulate social media and digital media, also provides for regulation of OTT platforms. The writer says that a law like the IT Act and the IT rules under it are the right medium through which OTT platforms and OTT technology has to be dealt with. They shouldn't be dealt with under the telecom law, which has been proposed by the government as the draft Telecom Bill and the existing Indian Telegraph Act. They both treat telecom industry as the sole preserve of the government, and only if the government permits or gives license and authorizes other private players, only then private telecom service providers can operate and provide their services. So entities falling under the Telecom Bill and the Telegraph Act, they will have to obtain mandatory licenses and authorizations in order to even start providing their services in the country. While this is justified for telecom service providers, it's important to recognize and distinguish OTT platforms from them. Because technologically speaking, OTT services are not essentially telecom services. OTT platforms make use of the telecom networks to deliver their services, and they themselves do not constitute a telecommunication service. So the writer's argument is that Telecom Bill is not the right place to regulate or control the OTT industry, and if such attempts are made, it could adversely affect OTT platforms and the entire digital ecosystem in the country. So the writer is recommending to take OTT services out of the draft Telecom Bill as they are appropriately regulated under the IT Act. Because the core principle of IT Act is that everything is permitted. That is, all digital activities on the internet is permitted unless explicitly prohibited by the law. So OTTs, just like any other internet-based service, enjoy more flexibility and freedom, which directly pushes innovation and brings more capital inflow into the sector. Currently, if you look at the IT rules, OTT platforms are regulated by the Information Broadcasting Ministry, and they're also subjected to the guidelines of the Censor Board. And the new IT rules also prescribe a self-regulation code for the OTT players. Hence, the writer is suggesting that if the government wishes better regulation of the OTT sector, it is better to bring OTT platforms under the proposed Digital India Act, which is likely to replace the IT Act. As technologically and legally, this would be a better law to deal with OTT platforms, and it would be unwise to include OTT platforms under the Telecom Bill. Now let's take up another editorial from page number 8, which deals with the Assam-Meghalaya border dispute, which has flared up in the last few days. On the 22nd of November, fresh violence has broken out between Assam and Meghalaya, where an incident occurred in which Assam Forest Guard and Assam Police have been accused of opening fire, in which the local residents of Meghalaya belonging to indigenous community have been killed. And this incident, which has taken place along the Assam-Meghalaya border in the West Khasi Hill region, has triggered a fresh round of tensions between the two states and has brought the spotlight on the pending border dispute between the two. And considering the political, security and socio-economic consequences of these border disputes in the northeast of India, the editorial is calling upon the centre to try and resolve these disputes immediately by working with the respective states. See, Assam is not new to such border disputes. During various points of time, Assam has had disputes with all its neighbouring states, including Nagaland, Mizoram, Arunachal Pradesh and Meghalaya. Just last year, if you remember, Assam and Mizoram were involved in a similar border standoff, which even turned violent. We had even covered this development in detail in our analysis. To understand the nature of these border disputes of Assam, you need to first understand that during British rule, Assam was a very large province that included present-day Nagaland, Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya and Mizoram. This continued even post-independence until some of these regions were carved out into autonomous regions and separate states, and Meghalaya was one such region. Meghalaya was carved out of Assam in 1970 as an autonomous region, and it was only in 1972 that Meghalaya became a full-fledged state. Since then, Meghalaya has had a different interpretation of its border with Assam, which has been disputed by Assam. Both the sides have a border dispute at 12 locations along the stretch of 884 kilometers border that they share, and in 2011, Meghalaya had identified these 12 sites, and following the setting up of multiple committees and multiple negotiations, recently in March, both the states have resolved 6 out of these 12 territorial disputes. In August, they even decided to set up regional committees to work towards resolving the other 6 disputes as well. So just when both the states were making progress towards resolving their border dispute, the issue has again flared up due to the fresh violence that has broken out, and these heightened tensions could derail the peace process and could prolong the border dispute. Now it's very important to consider the political, security and socio-economic implications of these border disputes and clashes in northeast India, because such clashes directly affect the local indigenous communities and could easily increase hostilities between the governments and also between the respective forces, and could also increase tensions between different ethnic groups. Constant violence and instability could also affect the economic and social well-being of these tribal indigenous communities, as it has a direct impact on their access to forest resources, which could in turn end up disrupting their livelihood. There are well-documented instances in the Northeast where such violence and volatility has even led to insurgencies in the region, which have had very serious implications for India's national security. So it's in this context that the editorial expresses concern about the number of border disputes present in Northeast India, and hence urges the centre to take immediate steps to resolve these disputes, and also calls upon the respective state governments to show greater maturity, as such internal conflicts would only weaken India's unity, which could potentially be misused by hostile elements and external powers. Now coming to the last topic, we have this article from page number 14, which refers to the draft Aircraft Security Rules of 2022, which has been notified by the Aviation Ministry. The Civil Aviation Ministry has recently notified the Draft Aircraft Security Rules 2022, which empowers the aviation security regulator, that is the BCAS or the Bureau of Civil Aviation Security, to impose stiff penalties amounting to 1 crore rupees on airports and airlines for any breach of security measures that are mandated through the rules. These new rules are proposed to supersede the Aircraft Security Rules of 2011, which has become a necessity after the Parliament amended the Aircraft Act by enacting the Aircraft Amendment Act in 2020. This amendment was enacted by the Parliament as it became necessary for India to give legal statutory powers to aviation security regulators such as BCAS, the DGCA, and Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau. These regulatory institutions did not have statutory backing, which placed India in contravention to international rules brought out by UN's aviation watchdog, the ICAO, or the International Civil Aviation Organization. The ICAO of the UN had repeatedly pointed out that India's regulators in the field of aviation security were functioning without a legal mandate and without any statutory powers, and this pushed India to enact the amendment to the Aircraft Act, which gave statutory recognition to these regulators. This mandated India to replace the old rules of 2011 with a new set of aviation security rules, and it's in this context that the Civil Aviation Ministry has brought out the Draft Aircraft Security Rules. If they are finalized and notified, these rules would bring India on par with ICAO norms and will give tremendous powers to BCAS. Through these rules, the BCAS can impose a fine of 50 lakh rupees to 1 crore rupees on both airports and airlines if they fail to meet the security standards. And large airports in particular would be mandated to meet the security standards laid out under the National Civil Aviation Security Program. They will have to ensure that the design and layout of the airport is in accordance with these provisions and put in place the recommended measures, failing which they shall be heavily penalized by the BCAS. Even individuals can face penalties for any violations in the range of 1 lakh to 25 lakh rupees. And the proposed rules also seek to empower the BCAS to suspend the airport security clearance which is granted to airports if they fail to meet the standards. So these draft rules have been kept in the public domain for inviting comments from all stakeholders and is seen as a major regulatory reform, as the powers which were confined to courts earlier are now being vested with regulators as well. Now let's take a look at the mains practice questions. The first question: India's trade pact with Australia is mutually beneficial. Analyze. The second question: can poor countries afford the cost of transitioning to clean energies? Critically discuss. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer rating portal, for which the link has been given in the description box below. So with this, I would like to conclude my discussion, and if you found the video to be helpful, do support us by liking the video, share it with other aspirants, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.